Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. Coming up on today's program, Sino-Australian ties. Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull embarks on a trade mission to China, 3 months into a free trade agreement that is already seeing benefits. And we sat down with former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, whose position as a political insider has given him some unique insights on the U.S. And we begin today's show with Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's first official visit to China since taking office in September last year. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has held a welcome ceremony for his Australian counterpart. Both sides agreed to make the best use of the complementary advantages for deepening cooperation and sign deals covering areas including innovation, tourism, industrial parks, and mining. During Turnbull's 2-day visit, he is expected to touch on political issues and will also meet with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Since he established diplomatic ties 44 years ago, China and Australia have achieved fruitful results through cooperation. With Turnbull's current visit, many people are delighted to see a new level of strategic partnership between China and Australia. This will not only ensure sustainable development, they say, but also safeguard peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region and even beyond. China has been Australia's biggest trade partner for years, and last year the bilateral trade volume approached nearly 150 billion yuan, almost a third of Australia's foreign trade volume. And more than 3 months after the free trade agreement between the two countries went into effect, some sectors of Australia's economy are already seeing benefits, with the promise of more to come. Greg Navarro has more from Sydney.
For Malcolm Turnbull, his first official trip to China as Australia's Prime Minister gives him a break from his recent political problems back home. Those include shrinking poll numbers in an election year. The scope of his China trip, leading the largest trade mission ever beyond the country's shores, presents Australian businesses and industries with a unique opportunity.
Well, I think it's game-changing. It's really taking advantage of having signed an agreement, the Chinese-Australia Free Trade Agreement. It's taking it beyond just signing an agreement and actually putting it into action.
Austrade's Graham Barty says the week-long trade mission will send 1,000 people from a variety of backgrounds across China.
In particular, taking companies that may not have been exposed to China, but the thing we're really doing, which is making a big difference, is the size of the delegation. 1,000 delegates, in basketball terms, a full court press across China, 8 simultaneous trade missions in areas of expertise and where we believe Australia has comparative advantage and capability.
Barty will lead an innovation team that includes people from research institutions, incubators, and even startups. The latest trade mission follows the official start of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, signed last year under former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott.
Thank you.
After 10 years of negotiations and years of raised expectations about freer trade with China, some Australian industries are finally reaping the rewards.
In things like healthcare, Blackmores has already been able to sign some very significant deals because of the growing middle class and emphasis on well-being and health in China. And in building in these second and third tier cities right around China, the new architecture provisions that allow Australian building and architecture experience have greatly benefited their bidding for contracts.
Agriculture is another winner of the initial tariff reductions, along with increased demand for things like dairy products and Aussie beef.
Cattle prices quite high in Australia in the expectation that we're going to increase our exports to China. And sheep meat prices are pretty good at the moment too. So we're certainly seeing activity there. We're seeing activity in the wine industry.
China is already Australia's biggest trade partner. In 2014, that relationship was worth more than $80 billion US, accounting for roughly 1 out of every 3 export dollars Australia earned. Experts say one of the most immediate impacts from the free trade agreement has been the incentive it's created for many Australian businesses, startups, even industries to start thinking more about how best to do business with China.
Business really has to pick up the ball and run with it. Government can't create business and make business work properly. It can certainly be a facilitator, a door opener, but we've really got to take advantage of the opportunity presented.
And that's important as Australia tries to replace the void left by the end of the mining boom with a more flexible economy. with a greater emphasis on agriculture and service sector exports. Greg DeBarro, CCTV, Sydney.
For more on Turnbull's visit to China, we are joined here in the Beijing studio by two guests, one from Australia and one from China. From China, we are having Mr. Yang Xiyu, who is a senior fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. And also, we are going to welcome Professor Gregory McCarthy, who holds a personal chair of Australian politics at the University of Western Australia and is now currently the BHP Billiton Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University here, based in Beijing. Welcome as well, Professor.
Pleasure.
What is the priority, trade or politics, Mr. Yang?
Of course, trade and investment.
Only because it's easier?
No, because of the top priority or top interests for both of the sides benefiting from the bilateral relations.
What do you think, Professor?
I think basically right. The basic idea is trade is important, but for Malcolm Turnbull, who is a businessman, trade and politics cross over all the time. He's very China literate, and therefore he sees the relationship between trade and politics to be strongly important. So I think they're intertwined in his mind.
Let's talk about politics a little bit, because it might be hard to talk about it, and then let's put it in the front. Disputes in the South China Sea. Of course, that also attracted the attention of Australia. Australia sometimes takes sides, apparently, from the Chinese perspective. Other times, Australia seems to be quite relaxed. What exactly is Australia's position? Is the Prime Minister likely to raise the issue of South China Sea and territorial disputes? What would that mean eventually for the nature of relations between these two countries? Professor McCarthy.
I think he's trying to steer a course between China and America on this regard. He's developed a sort of formula that tries to say that we're not intervening in this process. But he's doing it through his own background, which is a legal background, and he sort of says, if we can only get the legal order right, and if China would only agree with the legal order, then it will be fine. But he doesn't see China's point of view, which is that this is a sovereignty issue, not a legal issue. So I think he's trying to steer a course that China won't understand, and that this difference between cultures, difference between our political systems, will cause problems.
Legal system for whom? Of course, that's a eligible question, I guess, Mr. Yang, coming from China. And secondly, if China looks at it as a territorial issue of its own, then it's a very different nature we are talking about. We all know international law have different clauses. All the countries who try to claim the territory could go to different clauses of the international law. Therefore, it's the legal system Professor McCarthy talked about, which is the Prime Minister might subscribe to, really going to be the eligible one?
Well, I think Australia and other Western countries, especially the United States, take a very selective and double standard-like terms regarding to the legal system. For example, if we talk about rule of law of South China Sea, I would say first thing first for Philippines is they should go back to their constitution stemmed from the two U.S.-Spain treaties plus U.S.-Britain treaties. Those three treaties exactly define the boundary lines of the whole Philippine Islands. For example, we talk about Huangyuan Islands. And according to Philippines constitution, the very clear definition is their farthest eastern boundary line is in the 118 degree, but the Huangyuan Island is far from that degree. So if they really talk about the rule of law, just return to your constitution. They claimed they were the first founder of the island in 1960 or 56.
We could go into details about all of these islands one by one. Of course, these are all very important principles when it comes to countries in the territorial disputes. But what would that mean for Australia's awkwardness, in a way, to be this go-betweener or the one who has to take a position if being asked? What exactly is Australia's agenda out of this, Professor McCarthy?
I think Malcolm Turnbull is quite astute at this. He's not trying to go down the agenda which the Americans want him to go down, which is to send in a warship and to play a different kind of public game. He's trying to simply say, let The Hague have a look at it. It gives him space, particularly as it's building up towards an election, not to follow the Americans in this path. So it actually gives him an out. The legal position gives him an out not to be seen taking sides.
But Australia did participate in the military exercises involving Australia, the Philippines, and the United States, of course. And recently, we have also been hearing Australia, for example, last year, a dispute in Darwin. Of course, many American military are still based there. It's supposed to be one of those bases in the Asia-Pacific region for the U.S. There is a dispute between China and Australia about whether Australia could sell certain port to the Chinese when it comes to operation rights. So all of these are interestingly intertwined, the politics and the economic issues.
Yes.
Professor McCarthy, it seems that it's something that Australia cannot escape. Australia has to have a clear understanding of where it is.
I think you're right. There's a certain subtlety that
Yes, indeed.
the Prime Minister has, which Australia has yet to catch up with, I think. He's sort of arguing something different than some of the previous Prime Ministers, and that he's arguing is that perhaps in 20 years' time, Asia will be quite distinctly different. He sees India rising rapidly, he sees Indonesia growing, and he sees China having the prominent role in Asia. Then that raises a question he sort of puts on the table about what will happen in 20 years' time in regards to America. And so he's offering quite a distinctly different position than his predecessors. I think he's seeing that the power balance is shifting, and he continually uses the parable that Xi Jinping used about we shouldn't worry about the rise of China the same way that Sparta worried about the rise of Athens. So he uses that metaphor to say we shouldn't worry.
Mr. Yang, we've seen various expressions of politics coming from quite distinctive administration in Australia. And by the way, your administration changes very fast.
Yes, we've
Over
had
the past
7 in 5 years
or
or something. Yes, we have.
And so you see very different positions coming from different administrations at different times.
Yep.
So what is China's understanding of where Australia is vis-a-vis China's position in the Asia-Pacific region? Is Australia having a persuading power, or at least a partnership power, with China, not only on the business and economic side, but also in terms of the territorial issues, in terms of the political issues?
Well, I think Australia, although it's a European-based or Western-style country, is more and more like an Asian country. In Asia, several countries are divided by economic and political considerations between the China and the U.S. positions. And by the same token, Australia now is, when they think about economic factors, they take China in more consideration, and vice versa, more Americans whenever they talk about the politics or security issues. So this divided position always make Australian administration something swing this end and the other end. But in line, I don't think different administration has a sharply different positions towards the Asia Pacific. Look, Australia is one of the major founding members of APEC. And back to 1990s, Australia has determined to turn their strategic focus towards Asia rather than to the Europe. So since then, each Australian administration make a focus on Asia. That's the major trends. But along the trends, political and economic, they always swing between the major powers.
Well, talking about those pendulum, let's take a look at what exactly one end of the pendulum is, which is the economic and trade ties. If you look at the investment coming from Australia, partly because analysts believe Australia has a relatively stable economic environment over the years. Take a look at this. Australia has been China's second most favored outbound investment destination since the year 2005. China beefed up investments into Australia in the year 2015 by 1/3 in US dollar terms and a more stunning 60% in Aussie dollar terms. This exactly is one of those areas in which China and Australia work together in terms of trade and economic ties. How much will that mean for Australia's own economy and its own economic transformation?
I think there's two things going on that you mentioned before. The complementarity between Australia and China has been really strong. When China had its 5-year plan to grow through investment and infrastructure, then Australia benefited by iron ore and coal sales. Now China's changed its position to be much more qualified investment. Its investments around the world are really strategically clever at the moment, much cleverer than they have been for a long time, and that's true in Australia. They've shifted from real estate and mining into investments into commerce, health, renewable energies. And so you're seeing complementarity in a different way, and that's why the trade mission here of 1,000 business people are all about showing the new complementarity between China shifting towards a consumer-led economy and Australia being very strong about consumer services. So that's where the new complementarity is on about. And you can see this in the way China's investment in, say, real estate in Sydney's occurred. It's shifted from housing into commerce, hotels, property that relates to the way China's heading, particularly the tourist industry. Those people are buying hotels so Chinese tourists can go and stay in there.
Well, all of these sounds beautiful, but Professor McCarthy, as you have heard from Mr. Yang earlier, China is quite confused about this divide of mentality inside Australia, for example. When it comes to trade and economic ties, go to China. When it comes to political and also territorial issues, let's go to another different direction. So, but according to the Chinese, the economics and politics sometimes intertwine with one another, and it has to, because that's where confidence comes from towards one another. So how does that work for Australia? Will that be a long-term strategy? Long-term, will it work?
In some senses, economics drives politics in an old way. There's a famous saying in Australia that in some senses, economics drives politics. In China, politics drives economics, which is both true and false. But in Australia, the sense in which economics is driving politics, you can see that in the example you showed before in regard to the Darwin ports. America complained about the leasing of the ports to the Chinese, but the Australians agreed with it. So that shifted politics. You could see that in regards to the Asia Investment Bank. The politics were follow America, no, we're going to follow our own level. So I think economics in Australia is driving politics.
Interesting to talk about the AIIB. Everyone believes it is certainly an economic and trade issue, but at the same time, geopolitics from the very beginning comes into play. Mr. Yang, I still remember very well when the Australian side announced to join the AIIB. Everybody took it as a big surprise. It was during the Boao Forum.
Yes.
Last year.
Oh yes, last year the finance minister made a very.
You were there.
I was there, and I didn't expect. Originally, the foreign minister, their embassy here, come to the organizer of the annual conference, say their finance minister wanted to join in a session regarding to AIIB. Of course, organizer were happy and invited the finance minister be there, but never expect that they will make some breaking news. They indicate that Australia has decided to join in the AIIB, but at that time, majority believed because of the American intervention, Australia government would not join in the AIIB, but they did. So take this case in my theory. I mentioned always swings politically and economically. Practically speaking, when an issue is really pure economic issue, obviously, certainly go to China. A pure security or political, go to US. However, if the issue relating both the economic and political, then the disputes not a problem to China, but the problem neither to US, not to China, but the problem to Australia. They say economically AIIB should be beneficial, but politically should be benefit for China. So oppose or support, then they have a dispute, and you and China look and wait till their decision.
Right. Well, Professor McCarthy was laughing out loud when you were saying the textbook principle. It seems. Tell me, Professor, about that internal debate inside your country regarding AIIB. There was a lot of debate about that before the announcement was being made. And now, 1 year later, how do people look at that decision? And what can be the implication of this specific decision for future China and Australia ties?
You have to think about Australia as divided in some senses in defence terms, and that there are people in Canberra who have a very strong pro-Washington position and the people who are more neutral. The debate in Australia over the AIIB had to deal with the fact that President Obama rang up Prime Minister Abbott at the time and said don't join. but the financial arm of the state said join. So the people who'd run finances, economics, the people who turned up at the forum, drove the agenda and won the debate inside the cabinet, and that includes the Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, who was able to win that case. So there's always divisions, and there are strong, loud voices in Canberra that want to push the Washington position, and there are those who are seeing a different position, not both economically but politically. We have to shift.
Yes, indeed. But what about the other areas when it comes to economically? For example, the banking sector these days seems to be an interesting story, ever evolving between China and Australia. Meanwhile, iron ore has always been a big export item from Australia to China, but China's economy has been going through this transformation, much less investment on the internal building in a way, more on consumption. So that has a big impact on all of these raw materials, of course, Australia being affected. So how have those areas been? What will Australia rely on when it comes to future attractiveness to China economically?
I think it's the way in which the Prime Minister presents it is this innovation economy. He sees in China the sense in which China is really moving in an innovative way, particularly with high technology, faster than Australia is. And you only need to look at the use of the mobile phone in China to be much greater in Australia and the way it's used. And he sees that as complementarity, that we can help there. Secondly, he sees both societies have got an ageing population. We're very good at aged care. We offer high quality services in a variety of ways that China could benefit from. So he sees that as important. Education, quite clearly. We have 115,000 Chinese students there as I speak. So education is important. He sees the same language that Xi Jinping uses in terms of innovation. He uses the same language. He thinks the complementarity will work because of consumer-led positions on both sides.
Mr. Yang, certainly we can learn some lifestyles from Australia.
Oh, yes.
Much more laid down under.
Yeah. Well, I think there are obviously different advantages between the two sides, and especially in terms of the innovations, both sides has the share the same focuses, but with different advantages. So I think the economic ties will be more diversified and a wider range of the cooperation and the potential for the economic ties.
All right. We've been talking about the brilliant side of economic and trade ties, but I have to, as a journalist, always go to some of the other areas. Once again, I want to remind you before we wrap up today's show, because we all understand very well this world, politics and trade and economics are always intertwined and entangled. Sometimes one plays a major role, the other more a minor, sometimes the other way around. So let's take a look. Whether it's a major role or not, it is still a fact. Earlier, China responded harshly to Australia's recent defense white paper, which included critical comments on the South China Sea. But meanwhile, in his laureate lecture, Turnbull said this: the extraordinary economic growth of our region, especially China's, has depended on a long period of more than 40 years of relative tranquility. There is too much at stake to risk disturbing it. That's what the Prime Minister of Australia said. But internally, inside your country, Professor McCarthy, politics is still a big thing. You got the opposition party certainly trying to put their fingers on Mr. Turnbull. Why not raising some of the harsh issues with China? So how do you perceive his trip in China? He's likely to meet the Chinese President Xi Jinping on Friday. So what are likely to be his attitude, and how is he likely to frame Australia's views toward China?
I think he's quite interesting, and he's read in different ways. Some people see him as being sort of mild on China, too soft on China. Some people see him as too harsh on China. The speech he made at the Lowy Institute was quite clever, because normally in that speech it has a process to say it's the United States that's created this tranquility. But he's left that out, is to say it's the notion of two countries coming together. And he uses again that in that same speech the argument about the rising China shouldn't create anxiety. So I think he and Xi Jinping will get on very well together. He has a strong link back to Gough Whitlam, which he admired greatly, and he worked with Gough Whitlam's son. So he has a big history, and he's the only Prime Minister I've heard talk about the fact that if it wasn't for China going to war with Japan and the Japanese-China forgotten war in Australia, that Japan would have invaded Australia. So I think he's very widely read, very literate about China, and I think they'll get on very well together and shape a new relationship.
Mr. Yang, your final words?
China has more, regarding to the differences, the most urgent issue is South China Sea. But I should one sentence. China has more concern than any country else on the peace and the stability and the freedom passages on South China Sea, because 80% of the passages through South China Sea directly relating to Chinese economy.
Mr. Yang Xiyu and also Mr. Gregory McCarthy. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. This is an interesting story. Australia, not necessarily on daily news in China, but today it's a big celebration. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us.
Thank you.
Accompanying Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's visit to China is Australia's largest ever delegation to China. One of the groups in the delegation has expertise in health and elderly care, as we mentioned earlier in our discussion. The group's aim is to explore emerging trends and business opportunities and to help China enhance its service delivery in the sector. Ho Na caught up with some of them and filed this report. Take a look.
A delegation of more than 1,000 Australian business people constituted the country's largest ever trade mission to China. The visit comes hard on the heels of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which came into force last December. In the Chinese capital, the health and elderly care industries is where their special focus is trained.
Well, across all of healthcare, there's great opportunities. There's already a lot happening in research. Our researchers developing sorts of similar approaches, devices, clinical trials and the like together. Aged care, so a lot of the management practices, a lot of the techniques for looking after aged people, I think are things that we've got experience in and that China might want to look at as well. And then, of course, as part of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, Australia now has the capacity to actually invest in and establish aged care facilities here in China.
I think China right now is going through a massive transformation in healthcare. This is stimulated by healthcare reform driven by the government policies, as well as a growing aging population. China will have one of the world's largest elderly population in the next coming years, and it's an issue that needs to be addressed.
Aging populations around the world are creating new opportunities and challenges for governments, healthcare systems, social services, and cultural traditions. China has a rapidly aging population with more than 130 million people aged 65 years or above, and that's 10% of the total population. China is investing heavily in health and aged care, with expenditure expected to reach 6.5 to 7% of the GDP by 2020. Experts say there are enormous opportunities of cooperation between the two countries.
China has very advanced hardware and facilities in the healthcare industry, but we are lagging behind in software and staff training.
Massive opportunities. There is so much that we can bring in from Australia. For example, many people think the accreditation standards and legislation in Australia is very, very complicated, but in actual fact it's very easy to bring into the day-to-day opportunities within aged care facilities.
According to China-Australia Free Trade Agreement for health and aged care services, China will permit Australian service suppliers to establish profit-making aged care institutions throughout China and wholly Australian-owned hospitals in certain provinces. Australian-owned aged care institutions are now partnered with Chinese firms across China to help develop the aged care industry and improve the healthcare system. Ho Na, CCTV, Beijing.
Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. We sit down with former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who has a special interest in geopolitics. He shares some unique insights on the United States.
And so it follows that you will...
Welcome back. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News. Since World War II, Australia has become the U.S. important ally in the Asia-Pacific region. Under the ANZUS Treaty signed in the year 1951, military and political ties between the two countries have increased immensely. In the Asia-Pacific region, both China and the United States play important roles. Over the years, Australia's relations and the U.S. than on domestic issues. Kevin Rudd, a former Australian politician who was twice Prime Minister of Australia, sat down for a chat with us. As the first Australian Prime Minister who speaks fluent Mandarin, he pays close attention to both China and the U.S. He shared some of his views on U.S. politics and diplomacy. Let's have a look.
I think at this stage of the process, it is impossible to predict who the Republican candidate will be. Trump or Cruz or even a third-party candidate. A third candidate not currently prominent in the US primaries, whether it's Kasich or even someone else, like the President of the House, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mark Ryan. Who knows? But the Republican Party has gone through, I think, fundamental internal challenges. And this has been happening over a long period of time. And you have a strong, what I describe as almost anti-government, anti-politics tradition now within the right wing of the Republican Party, which we usually call the Tea Party, which has kind of got out of control. And as a result, we have a deeply split Republican Party in a way we haven't seen for a long time. There's a second factor at work which applies to both political parties, and that has to do with the future of the American middle class. And the future of the American middle class is that I've seen data recently which says for the first time in US history the middle class is not only shrinking in size, it now represents less than half of the American population. Now, the mainstay of mainstream Republican and Democratic politics, at least since World War II, has been this buoyant American middle class, the vehicle for social and economic mobility. And suddenly it's under threat and pressure. And so we then start to see some of the polarization of politics that we've seen both in relation to the support for Senator Sanders' campaign and, of course, for Mr. Trump's campaign as well. But given I am the President of the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York, I do not wish to comment publicly on any of the individual candidates in terms of are they good, bad or indifferent.
But eventually, what this trend could mean for the U.S. International policy choices, that is very relevant to your job, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. What America does in the world affects all of us. What America doesn't do in the world affects all of us. Okay? And therefore, these are profound questions. And often the most profound question in national political life in the United States is the mindset of the Commander-in-Chief, but frankly, the competence and the skills of those immediately advising the Commander-in-Chief, whoever she or he may be.
You were talking in a recent event in New York about your perception of U.S. politics.
Yeah.
And that has a lot to do with the question we discussed earlier. What does the U.S. have in mind as priorities? You said you were very upset, quote unquote, with one phrase that American politicians keep on feeding you. Quote, "It ain't gonna happen." And
Kevin.
Yeah. So help us to understand, for those viewers who haven't really been reading your articles, help us to understand what you meant. And what does it say about the nature of U.S. politics and how U.S. politicians these days, at the very center of their policymaking, think about themselves internationally?
Yeah, well, those comments in particular I've made in the United States about two big problems that I perceive in the American democracy. I've been very blunt about them because they're not partisan comments, they're structural comments. And the two comments are these. One, when you have effectively unrestricted campaign finance in the United States, whereby an unlimited amount of money can be spent on election campaigns, ultimately that gets pretty dangerous in terms of the viability of a political system. The second is in the US democratic system, the way in which in the House of Representatives congressional districts are designed. This power lies in the hands of the relevant state governments of the United States, which means that those boundaries are drawn by the state governments, whoever happens to be in government in those state governments. So if we were to pull out a map here of the 500 or 600 seats in the United States House of Representatives and see these maps doing crazy things. Why? Because they've been designed to maximize the Republican vote or maximize the Democratic Party vote in a particular constituency. Again, that is a problem with the political system. And so, for the American system, I believe, to be at its best, these structural problems need to be dealt with. But when I raise it with many of my friends in the United States, Republicans and Democrats, that's when I get the response, which is...
It ain't gonna happen, Kevin.
Yeah, that's right. Look, Kevin, understand your logic. We get it, but it just ain't gonna happen. Because these two questions have become so entrenched. But I believe they are questions which have to be dealt with for the future of the American political system.
But what about their international priorities? It also has to do with what they think internationally and what role the U.S. wants to play, whether it's going to look inward most of the time or look outward as it used to be. And as a result of this struggling, what would that mean for the rest of the world, including U.S.-China relations? I think these are very viable questions to be asked.
I think the first thing to always bear in mind with the United States is that when we look at its US military and the US economy, a very simple word of advice to the international community is never underestimate either. I mean, the United States has a formidable global military, not just in this region, the Asia Pacific, but all over the world. And it's a product of decades of investment, almost centuries of tradition and training. And similarly with the economy. I mean, it was only a few years ago everyone was saying that's the end of the United States. And then that was prior to the rise of China, and then go back a couple of decades, that's the end of the United States because of the rise of Japan. Well, Uncle Sam's not doing too badly as far as the economy is concerned. And the ability of the American economy to continually reinvent itself should never be underestimated because the power of its science and technology and the power of its innovation and its enterprise. So, these are what I describe as structural factors in terms of long-term American power and influence. Your question then goes to the nature of American political leadership and what will be the priorities set by US administrations in the future. I think the one thing I could say, having observed the process closely in the last couple of decades, is the strategic overreach by the United States in the first decade of the 21st century, most acutely in Iraq, has caused a reaction in the United States saying, be very careful about where you deploy your troops in the world in the future. That is no bad thing, to cause the American body politic and the American congressional and presidential leadership to say, let us reflect carefully on whether strategic objectives can be realized. I think that's an important change, but it's not in the span of US foreign policy history. It is not, frankly, unique. After the First World War, the United States retreated into itself, refused to ratify the League of Nations, and frankly did its own thing for the subsequent 20 years. After the Second World War, the United States said, well, that didn't work. Again, we've had to come in and play the decisive role in concluding the war, both in Europe and in the Pacific. But if we simply retreat again, what's going to happen? Hence the establishment of the United Nations, hence the establishment of the Bretton Woods institutions, and hence America's decision to remain a global military power after the war. But if you look at the span of American history, it's sometimes been introspective and sometimes outward-looking. The future US administration, I cannot comment on what would happen under various of the Republican candidates. I know former Secretary of State Clinton very well. I think Secretary of State Clinton has a very clear-eyed view about America's future in the region and in the world.
Kevin Rudd, former Australian Prime Minister, now working very hard on China-US relations, talking to us earlier about his understanding of US politics and the ongoing US presidential election. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.